up until, from the late 90s until 2008 about, I was deeply, deeply involved in a methodology and in an approach which is called group relations. I don't know if anybody here knows it. It's a, okay, there's a few people. I think I remember you from the Netherlands in group relations, and I was deeply, deeply involved in group relations, and I worked that way. And starting in 2010, I radically shifted my approach for personal reasons. And now I work with an approach which is called genuine contact. And the stories that I'm going to tell, one of them is from working with this approach called group relations, and one is from working with the approach called genuine contact. And that's important to me because basically both of these methods have a huge heart. And at the center of their heart, as far as I can understand them, they both want to empower people and organizations to become more healthy and more vital and more resilient. They really want to have a better world. And both of them come from that place. However, both of them come from that in a different way. And they have some different basic principles, and they have some different areas of their worldviews, and their different ideas about how to do it. So if you're in a group relations setting, and usually the learning style is a conference, if you're in a group relations conference, you'll have a certain kind of feel, and a certain kind of result, and a certain kind of action that's very different from if you work in a genuine contact process. And for me, that was quite interesting when the stories came up. So I'm going to tell the stories with a little bit of context. The group relations story, which is the first one, it happened in 2008, and it happened here in the Netherlands at a group relations conference. And it was at the end of the conference, so it's a learning conference, an experiential conference, and at the end there's something called role analysis. And role analysis is where all of the learnings that you have in the conference, you're trying to bridge that boundary and go across the role and think, how am I going to bring this out into the world? So everything I've learned here, how do I bring it out into the world? And in this particular way that we worked, you had these conversations and you had an hour, you had 60 minutes for that conversation. And when I say 60 minutes, I mean like 60 minutes. I don't mean 60 minutes and 25 seconds. I don't mean 60 minutes and 10 seconds. I mean 60 minutes as much as possible. And that's part of the procedure and the protocol of that method. So there I was with this man who was a high-ranking civil servant working in a social organization. And this is what I looked like. I don't know if you can see it. But we walked into the room, and there I was. And he started talking about what he needed to explain, and he was going to explain his role in the system that he worked in and try to understand the system in his mind and how he could make innovation. So there we were, he was talking, and I would say within 3 minutes of that talk, I realized that although I understood every word he said, although he was speaking a language that I understood, I literally understood nothing. I had no idea what he was talking about. And in that method, one of the things that went through my head is this now my unclarity or his unclarity? Should I slow it down to make sure that I get clarity? But I was looking at him and he really seemed to be into the story. And I was completely, I have to be honest, I was like really terrified in that moment because I really didn't know what to do. And what started to happen to me at that moment is there was, and that's where the not knowing, this deep knowing happened. What happened to me at that moment is I just said, okay, what does a group relations consultant do? I walk out in 60 minutes, no matter what. I am supposed to listen to the story and try to find and contribute where do I see what might be going on in the system, in his mind, and the role. So I'm trying to think of that and offer hypotheses, not a conversation. So offer hypotheses about that, and I make sure that no one else walks into the room. And I do that in the spirit of this method as much as I could. And so I sat there, and I think in that entire hour I said 3 things to him, which I thought were consistent. I made my little hypotheses in my talks, and he every time said, no, that's not it at all. And I was like, okay, so continue. And somewhere around 3 minutes before the end of this conversation, he looked at me, he smiled, and he said, "Oh my God, I get it." And he started to have this deep, deep, deep insights. And he was talking, and I still understood nothing. Yeah. So I was, okay. Deep, deep insights, and he had ideas, and he had actions, and I left because it was 60 minutes, and that was my job, and I walked out of the room like, okay, and I actually went to the man who was running the conference, and he said, "How did it go?" I said, "I think it went well," and he said, "What was it about?" And I said, "I don't know," and I really don't, and he looked at me, and, bless him for the kind of person he was, he's like, "Oh, that's great." So that was this experience. And what was really interesting about it for me was that within that particular approach, within the conduct, within the frame of that approach, in living it, I was always getting results when I could do that right, getting results that were really consequent to the actual method without necessarily knowing why. And so the feel of that was really very, very beautiful, except there was one thing inside of me, which was as I was doing it more and more, I wasn't being able to handle the tension of what I felt was the worldview and what it was asking for me in terms of conduct. And it was a really difficult decision. It was really painful, but at some point I said, I don't think I can do this and be honest to the conduct that's being asked of me. So what I did is, through a lot of personal searching, I ended up at a different approach called genuine contact, which is an approach that's based in lots of insights around large group interventions, and especially around open space technology. And it has a very different series of beliefs, certainly in people, and it's very explicit about the beliefs, and it's very explicit about the approach. And I felt more at home there, and I feel more at home there. So that's the place where I'm practicing my conduct. And the second story is almost like the first, but I'll just mention it. I had a client, and we were having a conversation, and he said, "Oh God, I don't know how to deal with my new business. I need a strategy. It's really, really difficult." And he was really he's in a social justice organization, and it's highly political, and it was the closest thing to his heart. It's like his life, what he was doing, and he needed to create a strategy that was going to work for the government, like to make some money and get some subsidies. So he needed to have a plan. And I said, well, let's try. We'll use something called the medicine wheel tool, which is a genuine contact tool that has certain steps. And just briefly, the steps are: you start with the purpose, you go to leadership, you walk to vision, you go down and you look at community, you look at management, you look at the relationships, and you look at the environment. And at each step, you ask some questions and you go together. So there we are. We had about 4.5 hours here. And I came into that, and I started, and we went along, and first was fine, and again, 5 minutes later, he was having a great time, and I was completely lost. I didn't know what to do. And the beauty of that was that I spent those 4.5 hours saying, okay, all I can do is live as much of this behavior and conduct as I can within genuine contact and see what happens. And at the end, he had an amazing experience, and I still didn't know what happened. But I had luck with him because I still know him. And over the next 3 years, I started seeing what his vision was. Like, we could look at it and go, oh yeah, there's that piece. Oh yeah, there's that piece. Oh look, that came up. So we could see it. And again, it was really consistent and consequent with what he wanted. And it grew out of being consequent to the method. So there I was thinking about this talk, and I thought to myself, well, what is actually happening here? And a word kept coming up to me that I learned in another place, which is called conduct, or the word I knew, but the conduct, which is coming from the area of nature connection, which I can talk to you about at another point, which is another one of my passions. And they were saying, you have structures, you have protocols, you have beliefs, you have lived behaviors. And whenever you're doing something, you need to hold yourself in that conduct, like the correct conduct when you walk into a forest, and the forest will treat you differently. Or the correct conduct when you meet someone. And that conduct is based on the beliefs of what you want to see in the world afterwards. And I felt like these stories are, to me, about conduct. They're about looking at and figuring out what, not even thinking about my ideas, but following that at that moment. And I had some insights, and I'll just briefly tell them to you, and I'll look at them. So the first one is, I think when we're in these highly complex and uncertain times, our desire, because we're so much in love, we want to make the world a better place, we want things to go well, is to try to understand, to analyze, to figure it out in the moment. And while that can be helpful, I think it's also a trap. And I think that we don't know, we can never know, we can't sit here and ever get all of the complexity in the room. The other thing that I realized is that the situation, so the world we're living in right now, or the context, or those men, or the system that lives through them, they know what's there. It's sitting there. And what it needs is the appropriate conduct so that it can come out without me mediating it with my mind. And I call it the lived spirit of the method, the conduct. It's the spirit, the life. For me, it's like the operationalization of what you say when you say walk the talk. And it's combining these these practices and these ways of walking in that and need to know what that is. And the last thing that I want to say is to surrender to it and be humble to that. And what I learned from doing this talk is when I do that, the knowing comes from the doing. And the doing is from looking back in the back and not analyzing it, but saying, what do I see? What do I see happening? What do I see growing in the end? And walking in that way. So, thank you very much. This is it.